Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
We're
I'm not
excited.
sure how you guys found me.
Well, I saw you on there. It was on the People You May Know thing on Facebook on the side. And a couple clicks later, here you are. So,
Excellent.
well, we're really happy to have you here. We're excited. And I'm curious to ask you, kind of first off, as a curator, your job is sort of to kind of create a narrative, tell a story by bringing these disparate art pieces together. Do you feel like it's important for you to tell stories that people haven't heard before?
That's personally important to me, but it's not necessarily something you could say about every curator.
Right.
I became a curator in a very different way than most. My background is not in art history, it's in advertising and marketing. So inevitably, I would find myself telling stories or having a narrative in what I'm doing in the art world because I spent my sort of younger life professionally telling stories for brands.
Right.
So now I'm telling stories for artists.
So because of that background, you feel like that, because the thing that I think is interesting about it is the artist himself has his own narrative going on within the piece, but you're part of that. Do you kind of consider yourself, this is your art as well, right? Kind of creating a story using these different artists.
I would say that on my best days, I feel like I'm an artist,
Okay.
but on most days, I do not feel like an artist at all. Having seen what real artists can do, I would never call myself an artist. I'm a facilitator. I help artists bring their work to the public.
What about in private, you and I just talking? Would you call yourself an artist?
The artist formerly known as.
So you used to be the director of communications at the Museum for African Art, and I was curious to ask you how people's view of African art has changed. Just because I think even not that many years ago, there has been this kind of like, people have treated it with this sort of like distant, weird, kind of dark continent kind of stuff. Do you think it's progressed, the view of African art has progressed in terms of how curators and other museums and galleries think about it, or?
That's absolutely true, but I think the thing I have to point out is that because of my role at the Museum for African Art, and I was only there for a year, but you know, a year is a decent amount of time,
Sure.
was dealing primarily with public relations and marketing. I didn't do any curatorial work there.
Okay.
I had been active as an independent curator before that job and continued to be active afterwards. But in terms of your question about African art, I mean, it's absolutely true. I mean, the reality is that most Americans, and I'm just to kind of focus on this country, most Americans have a very narrow view of what African art is.
Sure.
But the real problem is that Africa, you know, is so vast with 54 countries, there really is no such thing as African art. It would be the same as my saying to you, what do you think of North American art?
Because then you're representing, basically, you have, because in Africa especially, you've got, you know, there's tons of white people making art there. There's tons of, I mean, then we've got Inuit art in North America. You've got all this kind of stuff. So it's a huge place.
Right. I mean, I think it's driven by marketing. I mean, you know,
And it's fetishism kind of too. It
yeah,
seems.
you really can't talk about the art world without talking about money in some regards, right? So how we began to hear about certain kinds of art is sometimes driven by the media that we're exposed to, right? So if you read the New York Times or some other, you know, mainstream publications, when you find out about shows or exhibitions that are relating to African art, you're really hearing about the things that have sort of made it to a point of either having cultural currency or real sort of financial currency, not really the sort of under the radar stuff that's been going on forever. You're really hearing about sort of what's popular.
Yeah.
And so, for example, 3 years ago, the auction house Phillips de Pury, they had a themed auction called Africa. That was the theme of the auction. Probably 100 some odd artists in this auction, and most of the artists either were born in Africa or had some direct connection to the continent. But if you looked at the art in the catalog, you wouldn't necessarily categorize that in any one way, but they were using Africa more as a brand or an umbrella term because they realized that there was sort of bubbling interest within the collecting community for African art. Yeah.
Well, and now you've, some of the past exhibits that you've done, you did an exhibit about the Crown Heights riots, and there was a really fascinating one you did about gentrification. Do you find yourself compelled to tell sort of New York stories now?
Well, I was born and raised in Brooklyn. Thankfully just celebrated my 40th birthday about 3 weeks ago, and having lived in Brooklyn 99% of my life, I spent about a year or so outside of Brooklyn, living in upstate New York. But really, I'm Brooklyn through and through. I was born in Bedford-Stuyvesant. I've lived in about 8 different neighborhoods: Crown Heights, Park Slope, Brooklyn Heights, Fort Greene, Clinton Hill, Bed-Stuy, and so I know Brooklyn more than most.
Sure.
So for me, when there's an opportunity to tell a compelling story about Brooklyn's history and to use art as a way to tell that story, I'm all over it.
Yeah.
I love history as much as I love art. So a few years ago, the Museum of Contemporary African Diasporan Arts, better known as MOCADA, based in Fort Greene, approached me with the idea of doing a show about gentrification. I thought it was a wonderful idea. I had no idea how people would respond to an art exhibition about gentrification.
Yeah.
It seemed a little bit like I was all excited about it. And then the next day after I agreed to do it, I said to myself, what have I got myself into? Like, what is this? What show will this actually be?
Right. And so were you concerned with the reception of the show or how people would perceive it? I find often it seems like the art that sells is oftentimes apolitical at best, kind of shiny object-y type things going on. And so when art has a specific point of view or a message, and it's poking at money, then it gets into more of kind of a dangerous territory. Is that something that you considered when you were doing this piece, or?
Well, I didn't have to be that concerned with this particular show because it was in a public space, a non-commercial space, so none of the work was technically for sale. I didn't have to think about presenting work that would be collectible, so to speak.
Right.
It was really about how do we engage artists in this conversation. But then also, it was about being honest, because let's be honest, artists are in many ways a big part of gentrification to begin with.
Sure.
So, the irony of the show was not lost on me. The idea that I'm a curator bringing artists together from places like Williamsburg and Bushwick and Red Hook to talk about gentrification in Brooklyn. It's kind of like... So, so the subtitle for the exhibition, so it was the gentrification of Brooklyn, the pink elephant speaks, sort of like the elephant in the elephant in the room. So the reality is that, the 21 artists that were in that show, each and every one of them had their own sort of take on gentrification. Some of them were the very gentrifiers that the show was about.
Right.
Some of them had been priced out of their neighborhoods and had bounced around in 3 or 4 different neighborhoods chasing cheap rent.
I have a quick question. I actually left the Williamsburg, Greenpoint area for Newark, New Jersey. Do I count as gentrification there?
Absolutely, yes.
Follow-up question. Does it count as gentrification if it's just me?
That's all it takes.
Okay.
Well, what have you got going on right now that people can check out?
Well, a show that's coming up in a couple of weeks, actually, at Rush Arts Gallery is called Doing It in the Park. It's an art exhibition inspired by a independent film of the same name.
Babito Garcia.
Yes, co-directed by Babito Garcia and Kevin Kalu. So that opens on September 12th at Rush Arts Gallery. And then a bit further afield in November, I forget the exact date, so forgive me. I think we're actually still solidifying some specifics around the dates, but I'm curating the winter show for the Lower East Side print shop. So that should be a lot of fun as well. And one of these days I'm going to get around to launching a DexterWimberly.com website, but for now, everything that I do professionally is on my Facebook page as it happens.
See?
So there you go.
Told you. Dexter, thank you so much for coming on the show. Everybody give a big round of applause for Dexter Wimberly.